Guru Sakshat Parabrahma Tasme Sri Gurave Namaha Gananantva Ganapatigam Mavamahe Kavin Kavinam Upavashravastram Jeshtarajam Brahmanan Brahmanaspata Anushrunnoti Visida Sadhanam Om Mahaganadipataye Namaha Om Keshwaya Namaha Om Narayana Namaha Om Madhvaya Namaha Om Govindaya Namaha Om Vishnuvaya Namaha Matsudanaya Namaha Trivikramaya Namaha Vamanaya Namaha Sridharaya Namaha ऋषिकेशाय नमः पद्मनाभाय नमः दामोदराय नमः संकर्षणाय वासुदेवाय नमः प्रद्युम्नाय नमः अनिरुद्धाय नमः पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः दोक्षाय नमः नारसिंहाय नमः अच्युताय नमः जनार्दनाय नमः उपेन्द्राय नमः हरे नमः श्री कृष्णाय नमः श्री कृष्णाय नमः. Dear friends, we came to the 8th chapter of the 11th canto of Bhagavath Purana. In this 8th chapter, we are hearing about Avadutha Dattathreya, Vyakhyana, and story of Pingala. Lord Krishna told Uddhava how the Avadutha Brahmana explained to Maharaja Yadu the instructions he had received from 9 of his gurus, beginning with the Python. The instruction of the Avadutha Brahmana received from the Python is that an intelligent person should cultivate a mentality of detachment and should maintain his body by accepting whatever comes its own way accord or is easily obtained in this way. In this way, he should remain always engaged in the worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Even if no food is available, the person who wants to engage fully in the Lord's worship should not beg. Rather, he should understand this to be the arrangement of providence, thinking whatever enjoyment is destined for me will automatically come, and this I should not uselessly waste the remaining duration of my life in the worrying about such things. If he does not get any food, he should simply remain lying like the python and patiently fix his mind in meditation upon the Supreme Lord. The instruction the Avadutha Brahmana received from the ocean is that the mind of the sage who is devoted to the personality of Godhead appears very clear and grave, just like the still ocean waters. The ocean does not overflow during the rainy season when all the flooded rivers discharge their waters into it, nor does it dry up during the hot season. When the rivers fail to supply it similarly, the sage does not become elated when he achieves desirable things, nor does he become distressed in their absence. The instruction of the moth is that just as he becomes entitled by the fire and gives up his life, the moth will give up his life in the fire, thinking fire is nice, that will go and sit in the fire and die. The fool who cannot control his senses becomes enchanted by the forms of women decorated with gold ornaments and fine clothing. Chasing after these embodiments of the divine illusory energy of the Lord, he loses his life untimely and falls down into the most horrible hell. There are two kinds of bees, the bumblebee and the honeybee. The instruction learned from the bumblebee is that a sage should collect only small amounts of food from many different households and thus day after day practice the occupation of madhukari for maintaining his existence. A sage should also collect the essential truths from all scriptures. A sage should also collect the essential truths from all scriptures, be they great or insignificant. The instruction received from the second insect, the honeybee, is that the mendicant sannyasi should not save the food he begs for the sake of having it later that night or the next day. Because he does so, then just like the greedy honeybee, he will be destroyed along with his hoard. From the elephant, the Avadutha Brahmana received the following instruction. Male elephants are tricked by hunters into moving towards the captive female elephants, whereupon they fall into the hunter's ditch and are captured. Similarly, the man who becomes attached to the form of woman falls down into the depth well of material life and is destroyed. The instruction received from the honey thief is that just as he steals the honey collected with a great effort by the honey bee, a person in renounced order of life has the privilege of enjoying before anyone else the food and other valuable things purchased by the hard earned money of the householders. The instruction from the deer is that just as he becomes confused upon hearing the song of the hunter's flute and loses his life, so also does any person who becomes attracted to mundane music and song uselessly waste his life. The instruction learned from the fish is that because he comes under the sway of attachment to the sense of taste, he is caught on the baited fish hook and must die. Similarly, an unintelligent person who is victimized by his insatiable tongue will also end up losing his life. There was once a prostitute named Pingala in the city of Videha, and from her, Avadutha learned another lesson. One day, she dressed herself in very attractive clothing and ornaments and was waiting from the sunset until the midnight for customer. She waited in great anticipation, but as the time passed, her mind became very uneasy. No man came to see her, and in disgust, she finally renounced, giving up her hankering of the arrival of a suitor, arrival of a man. Thereafter, she engaged herself in thinking only of the Supreme Lord Hari, and her mind achieved the supreme form of peace. The instruction received from her is that hopes for sense gratification are the root cause of all suffering and evils. Therefore, only one who has given up such hankering can fix himself in meditation upon the personality of Godhead Krishna and achieve transcendental peace. These are the lessons learned from the various animals, actually, animals, birds and animals. Avadutha Upakhyana, it's called. So these are the summary of the 8th chapter, what I said to you now. Now start the details of the shlokas. Sukamahendriyakam rajan swarge naraka evacha dehinam edatya dukkaham tasman nechetta tadbudaha. Brahmana vacha. Brahmana is telling, Avadutha Brahmana is telling, O king, the embodied living entity automatically experiences unhappiness in heaven or hell. Avadutha Brahmana is telling the king Yadu, O king, the embodied living entity automatically experiences unhappiness in heaven or hell. Similarly, happiness will also be experienced even without one seeking it. Therefore, a person of intelligent discrimination does not make any endeavor to obtain such material happiness. One should not uselessly waste his life pursuing material sense of gratification, because a specific quantity of material happiness will automatically come to one as a result of one's past and present fruitive activities. This lesson is learned from the Ajagara or Python. One should not uselessly waste his life pursuing material sense gratification, because a specific quantity of material happiness will automatically come to one as a result of one's past and present fruitive activities. This lesson is learned from the Ajagara or Python, who lies down and accepts for his maintenance whatever comes on its way, on its own account. Remarkably, in both material heaven and hell, happiness and unhappiness come automatically due to our previous activities, although the proportions of happiness and unhappiness certainly variable. Either in heaven or in the hell, one may eat, drink, sleep, and have sex life, but these activities, being based on the material body, are temporary and inconsequential. An intelligent person should see that even the best material situation is actually a punishment for previous unlawful activities executed outside the scope of loving devotional service to God. A conditioned soul undergoes great trouble to obtain a little happiness. A conditioned soul undergoes great trouble to obtain a little happiness. After struggling in the material life, which is full of hardship and hypocrisy, one may receive a little sense gratification, but this illusory pleasure in no way offsets the burden of suffering one must bear to obtain it. After all, a pretty hat is no cure for a homely face. After all, a pretty hat is no cure for a homely face. If one really wants to solve, after all, a pretty hat is no cure for a homely face. If one really wants to solve life problem, one should live simply and reserve the major portion of one's life for loving service to Krishna. Even those who do not serve God receive a certain standard of maintenance from Him. Therefore, we can just imagine the security the Lord offers to those who dedicate their lives to His devotional service. Unrefined, fruitive workers foolishly worry only about the present life, whereas more pious karmis imprudently make elaborate arrangements for future material sense gratification, unaware that all such enjoyment is temporary. The real solution, however, is to understand that by pleasing the personality of Godhead, who is the master of all senses and all desires, one can attain permanent happiness. Such knowledge easily solves the problems of life. Grasam samrushta virasam mahantam soktameva va yadruchyeya vapatitim graseda jagaro kriyaha. Following the example of the python, one should give up material endeavors and accept for one's maintenance food that comes on its own account. Whether such food be delicious, tasteless, ample, or meager, we have to accept whatever it comes in the way. If at any time food does not come, then saintly person should fast for many days without making endeavor. He should understand that by God's arrangement, he must fast. Thus, following the example of Python, he should remain peaceful and patient. A saintly person should remain peaceful and materially inactive, maintaining his body without much endeavor. Even though possessed of full sensual, mental, and physical strength, a saintly person should not become active for material gain, but rather should always remain alert to his actual self-interest. A saintly sage is happily and pleasing in his external behavior, whereas internally he is most grave and thoughtful. Because his knowledge is immeasurable and unlimited, he is never disturbed, and thus in all respects he is like the tranquil waters of the unfathomable and unsurpassable ocean. During the rainy season, the swollen rivers rush into the ocean, and during the dry summer, the rivers, now shallow, severely reduce their supply of water. Yet the ocean does not swell up during the rainy season, nor does it dry up in the hot summer. In the same way, saintly devotees who has accepted the Supreme Personality of Godhead as the goal of his life sometimes will receive by providence great material opulence, and sometimes he will find himself materially destitute. However, such a devotee of the Lord does not rejoice in a flourishing condition, nor is he morass when poverty stricken. One who has failed to control his sense immediately feels attraction upon seeing a woman's form, which is created by the illusory energy of the Supreme Lord. Indeed, when the woman speaks with enticing words, smiles coquettishly, and moves her body sensuously, One who has failed to control his senses immediately feels attraction upon seeing a woman's form, which is created by the illusory energy of the Supreme Lord. Indeed, when the woman speaks with enticing words, smiles, and moves her body sensuously, his mind is immediately captured, and thus he falls blindly into the darkness of material existence, just as the moth, maddened by the fire, rushed blindly into the flames. A foolish person with no intelligent discrimination is immediately aroused at the sight of a lusty woman, beautifully decorated with golden ornaments, fine clothing, and other cosmic features. Being eager for sense gratification, such a fool loses all his intelligence and is destroyed just like the moth who rushes into the blazing fire. A saintly person should accept only enough food to keep his body and soul together. He should go from door to door accepting just a little bit of food from each family. Thus, he should practice the occupation of the honey bee. Honey bee goes from flower to flower to attract and suck the juice. Just as the honey bee takes nectar from all flowers, big and small, so intelligent human being should take the essence from all religious scriptures. A saintly person should not think, this food I will keep to eat tonight, and this other food I can save for tomorrow. In other words, a saintly person should not store foodstuffs required by begging, should not store foodstuffs acquired by begging. Rather, he should use his own hands as his plate and eat whatever it fits on them on each day. His only storage container should be his belly, and whatever conveniently fits into his belly should be his stock of food. Thus, one should not imitate the greedy honeybee who eagerly collects more and more honey all the time. A saintly mendicant should not even collect foodstuffs, eat later in the same day or the next day. If he disregards this injunction and, like the honeybee, collects more and more delicious foodstuffs, that which he has collected will indeed ruin him in the end of the day. A saintly person should never touch a young girl. In fact, he should not even let his foot touch a wooden doll in the shape of a woman. By bodily contact with a woman, he will surely be captured by illusion, just as the elephant is captured by the she-elephant due to his desire to touch her body. A man possessing intelligent discrimination should not under any circumstances try to exploit the beautiful form of a woman for his sense gratification, just as an elephant trying to enjoy a she-elephant is killed by other bull elephant also enjoying her company. One trying to enjoy the lady's company can at any time be killed by her other lovers who are stronger than he. A greedy person accumulates large quantity of money with a great struggle and pain, but the person who has struggled to so much to acquire the wealth is not always allowed to enjoy it himself or give it in a charity to others. The greedy man is like the bee who struggles to produce a large quantity of honey, which is then stolen by a man who will enjoy it personally or sell it to others. No matter how carefully one hides his hard-earned wealth or tries to protect it, there are those who are expert in detecting the whereabouts of valuable things and they will steal it. Just as a hunter takes away the honey laboriously produced by the honeybees, similarly saintly mendicants such as brahmanas, brahmacharis, and sannyasis are entitled to enjoy the property painstakingly accumulated by householders dedicated to family enjoyment. A saintly person dwelling in the forest in the renounced order of life should never listen to songs of music promoting material enjoyment. Rather, a saintly person should carefully study the example of the deer, who is bewildered by the sweet music of the hunter's horn and is thus captured and killed. Becoming attracted to the worldly singing, dancing, and musical entertainment of beautiful women, even the great sage of Rishyashringa, the son of Mrugi, fell totally under his control, just like a pet animal. Rishyashringa, the younger son of the sage Mrugi, was intentionally brought up by his father in an atmosphere of complete innocence. Mrugi Rishi thought that if his son were never exposed to a sight of a woman, he would always remain a perfect brahmachari. But by chance, the inhabitants of the neighboring kingdom, who were suffering from a long-term drought, received a divine advice that rain would return to their kingdom only after a Brahmana named Rishyashringa stepped foot in it. Therefore, they sent beautiful women to the hermitage of Mrugi to entice the Rishyashringa and bring him back with them. Since Rishyashringa had never even heard about women, he easily fell for their trap. The name Rishyashringa indicates that the young sage was born with a deer-like horn growing out of his forehead. If, like the deer, a rishi becomes attracted to the sweet musical sounds promising sense gratification, then, like the deer, he is quickly vanquished. A thoughtful person should humbly take instruction from the deer, who is doomed by attraction of musical sense of gratification. Rishyashringa Maharishi is from my village, is very near to Sringeri, place called Kiga. Rishyashringapura is called Kiga. And that place, Rishyashringa Maharishi was the son of sage Mrigi, was a great saint. Rishyashringa Maharishi, the same sage, went to Dasharatha Maharaja to do Putrakameshti Yaga for Dasharatha. And Rishyashringa is a great saint. Wherever he goes, the rain will follow him. That's why there is a yajna called Varuna Yajna. They perhaps Varuna and Rishyashringa will do the yajna so that rain will come in the place wherever he wants to do. Rishyashringa is a very popular sage in our village near Sringeri. That name of the place Sringeri came from his name Rishyashringapura. Rishyashringapura gradually changed it to Sringeri. Sringagiri, then it became Sringeri. Just as a fish incited by the desire to enjoy his tongue is fatally trapped on the fisherman's hook. Similarly, a foolish person is bewildered by the extremely disturbing urges of the tongue and thus is ruined. A fisherman places a meaty bait on a sharp hook and easily attracts the unintelligent fish who is greedy to enjoy its tongue to eat something. Similarly, people are mad after gratifying their tongues and lose all discrimination in their eating habits. For momentary gratification, they construct huge slaughterhouses and kill millions of innocent creatures, innocent animals. And by inflicting such atrocities, suffering, they prepare a ghastly future for themselves. Because they become tamasaguna, they become the animals in the next life. But even if one eats only the foods authorized by the Vedas, as per the Shastra, there is a still danger. One may eat too sumptuously, and then artificially stuffed belly will create pressure on the sexual organs. Thus, one will fall down into the lower modes of nature and commit sinful activities and lead to the death of one's spiritual life. From the fish, one should carefully learn the real dangers involved in gratifying the tongue. By fasting, learned men quickly bring all of the senses except the tongue under control. Because of abstaining from eating, such men are afflicted with an increased desire to gratify the sense of taste. Although one may conquer all of the other senses, as long as the tongue is not conquered, it cannot be said that one who has controlled all senses. However, if one is able to control the tongue, then one is understood to be in full control of all the senses. O son of kings, previously in the city of Videha, there dwelled a prostitute named Pingala. Now please hear the story of Pingala, what I have learned from that lady. Once that prostitute Pingala, desiring to bring a lover into her house, stood outside the doorway at night, showing her beautiful form. O best among men, this prostitute was very anxious to get honey, and as she stood on the street at night, she studied all the men who were passing by, thinking, oh, this one surely has honey, has money more. O best among men, the prostitute was very anxious to get money, and as she stood on the street at night, she studied all the men who were passing by, thinking, oh, this one surely has money. I know he has paid the price, and I'm sure he would enjoy my company very much. That sort of thing she has got. Thus she thought about all the men on the street. As the prostitute Pingala stood in the doorway, many men came and went, walking by her house. Her only means of sustenance was prostitution, and therefore she anxiously thought, maybe this one who is coming now is very rich. Oh, he is not stopping, but I am sure someone else will come. Surely this man who is coming now will want to pay me for my love, and he will probably give lots of money. Thus, with vain hope, she remained leaning against the doorway, unable to finish her business and to go to sleep. Out of anxiety, she would sometimes walk out toward the street, and sometimes she went back into her house. In this way, the midnight hour gradually arrived. And as the night wore on, the prostitute, who intensely desired money, gradually became morose, and her face dried up. Thus, being filled with anxiety for many and most disappointed, she began to feel a great detachment from her situation, and happiness arose in her mind. It appears from these verses that on this particular night, the prostitute Pingala was not at all successful in attracting customers to her house. Being completely frustrated and disappointed, she gradually became indifferent to her situation. Thus, great suffering sometimes leads one to the path of enlightenment, or according to a Sanskrit proverb, disappointment gives rise to the greatest satisfaction. The prostitute had dedicated her life to satisfying the lusty desire of many men, engaging her mind, body, and words in the service of paying lovers. She completely forgot the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus her mind was most unsteady and disturbed. Finally, being completely frustrated, her face and throat drying up, she began to feel indifferent to her situation, and happiness arose in her mind. The prostitute felt disgusted with her material situation and thus became indifferent to it. Indeed, detachment acts like a sword, cutting to pieces the binding network of material hopes and desires. Now, please hear from me the song sung by a prostitute in that situation. The network of material desires is created when one falsely thinks that he can establish himself permanently in the material world. This binding network should be cut by the sword of detachment. Otherwise, one will be forced to wander in the illusory network of Maya with no understanding liberated life on the spiritual platform. O King, just as a human being who is bereft of spiritual knowledge never desires to give up his false sense of proprietorship over many material things, similarly, a person who has not developed a detachment never desires to give up the bondage of the material body. The prostitute Pingala said, "Just see how greatly illusioned I am, because I cannot control my mind. Just like a fool, I desire lusty pleasure from an insignificant man." In the material existence of all the senses are attracted by different objects, and that the conditioned soul becomes the first class fool. The cause of material life is one's indifference to the absolute truth. The conditioned soul considers himself to be the Lord and enjoyer of the material world, and consider the purpose of life to be sense gratification. The more one tries to enjoy the material world, the more one's illusion increases. It appears from the verse that the prostitute Pingala was not only earning her livelihood through prostitution, but was actually enjoying her illicit contract with the innumerable men. The words Kantada Astaha indicate that she was freely selling herself without discrimination to the most ordinary and useless men, considering them to be lovers. Thus she says, "I was a great fool." The word Balisha means one who has childish mentality without practical experience of right and wrong. Santam Samipe Ramanam Ratipradam Vittapradam Nityamimam Vihaya Akamadam Dukkha Bhayadishoka Mohapradam Tuchamaham Bhajejna. I am such a fool that I have given up the service of that person who, being eternally situated within my heart, is actually most dear to me. That most dear one is the Lord of the universe, who is the bestower of real love and happiness and the source of all prosperity. Although he is in my own heart, I have completely neglected him. Instead, I have ignorantly served insignificant men who can never satisfy my real desires and who have simply brought me unhappiness and fear, anxiety, lamentation, and illusion. That's what she learned. The Pingala laments that she chose to serve most sinful, useless men. She falsely thought they would bring her happiness and neglected to serve the actual Lord of the heart where Krishna lives. She could understand how foolishly she had struggled for money, not knowing that the Supreme Lord is always inclined to award prosperity to his sincere devotees. The prostitute was proud of her ability to please men, but she now laments that she did not try to please the Supreme Lord by loving service or his own heart. The Supreme Lord is completely aloof from the transactions of the material world. Lord Krishna is the actual enjoyer of everyone and everything. But one must learn how to please the Lord by pure spiritual service. Aho mayatma paritapito vrata sanketa vrittati vigargya vartaya Srainanyaradyartha trusto anushchuchat kritena vittam ratimatmane chuti. Oh, now I have uselessly nurtured my own soul. I have sold my body to lusty, greedy men who are themselves objects of pity, thus practicing the most abominable profession, a prostitute. I hoped to get money and sex pleasure. That's what she did, and now she is repenting. The art of prostitution is based on awakening and enjoying the propensity in men. Apparently, this prostitute was so foolish that they maintained romantic conception of her profession and was actually trying to enjoy loving affairs with her customers, not realizing that they were the lowest of men with the most abominable motives. Like the prostitute Pingala, one should understand that by giving up the devotional service of the Lord, one simply becomes a victim of the illusory energy and suffers greatly. This material body is like a house in which I, the soul of living, the bones forming my spine, ribs, arms, and legs are like the beams, cross beams, and pillars of the house, and the whole structure, which is full of stool and urine, is covered by skin, hair, and nails. The 9 doors leading into the body are constantly excreting foul substances. Besides me, what woman could be so foolish as to devote herself to this material body, thinking that she might find pleasure and love in this contraption? The 9 doors leading into and out of the body are the two eyes and 2 nostrils, the mouth, the 2 ears, the genital and anus in the lower part, and also means bamboo. And indeed, the skeleton appears to resemble a bamboo construction. Just as a bamboo can immediately burn to ashes or chopped into pieces, similarly, the material body, which is constantly deteriorating, may at any time, may at any moment be crushed into powder, cut into pieces, drowned, burned, suffocated, and so on. Eventually, the body must disintegrate, and therefore, there is certainly no one as unfortunate as one who has dedicated himself heart and soul to this flimsy body, which is filled with unpleasant elements. Certainly, in this city of Vedeha, I alone am completely foolish. I neglected the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, who awards us everything, even our original spiritual form. And instead, I desire to enjoy sense gratification with many men. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is absolutely the most dear one for all living beings because he is everyone's well-wisher and Lord. He is the Supreme Soul situated in everyone's heart. Therefore, I will now pay the price of complete surrender and thus purchasing the Lord. I will enjoy with him just like Lakshmi Devi. The real friend of all conditioned souls is the Supreme Lord, and only he can award the highest perfection in the life. By following the example of Lakshmi Devi, who always remains at the lotus feet of the Lord, one will certainly obtain eternal happiness. One should make the best use of material body, which is a bad bargain, and surrender one's body, mind, and words to the Lord. Paying such a price, one can purchase the Lord, who is everyone's dearmost well-wisher. Thus, one's ancient one's ancient propensity for sense gratification will automatically be controlled. Men provide sense gratification for women, but all these men and even the demigods in heaven have beginning and an end. They are all temporary creations who will be dragged away by the time. Therefore, how much actual pleasure or happiness could any of them ever give to their wives? In this material world, everyone is basically pursuing his personal sense gratification, and thus everyone is being ruined by the influence of time. On the material platform, one actually helps anyone else. So-called material love is simply cheating process, as the Lady Pingala is now discovering. Although I most stubbornly hope to enjoy the material world, although I most stubbornly hope to enjoy the material world, somehow or the other, detachment has arisen in my heart, and it is making me very happy. Therefore, the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu must be pleased with me. Without even knowing it, I must have performed some activity satisfying to him. A person who has developed detachment can give up the bondage of material society, friendship, and love. And a person who undergoes great suffering gradually becomes out of hopelessness, detached and indifferent to the material world. Thus, due to my great suffering, such detachment awoke in my heart. Yet, how could I have undergone such a merciful suffering if I were actually unfortunate? Therefore, I am in fact fortunate and have received the mercy of the Lord. He must somehow or the other be pleased with me. With devotion, I accept the great benefit. With devotion, I accept the great benefit that the Lord has bestowed upon me, having given up my sinful desires for ordinary sense gratification. I now take shelter of Him, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's what she decided. Pingala decided, with devotion, I accept the great benefit that the Lord has bestowed upon me. Having given up my sinful desires for ordinary sense gratification, I now take shelter of Him, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. संतुष्टा शुद्ध दैत्ये तरेत्तालाभेन जीवति विहारामहिम नाम महात्मना रमणेन वै I am now completely satisfied and I have full faith in the Lord's mercy. Therefore, I will maintain myself with whatever comes of its own accord. I shall enjoy life with only the Lord because He is the real source of life and happiness. That's how she decided. Samsarakupe patitam vishayarye mahite kshanam grastam kalahinatmanam konestratu madishwaraha. The intelligence of the living entity is stolen away by activities of sense gratification, and thus he falls into the dark well of material existence. Within that well, he is then seized by the deadly serpent of time. Who else but the Supreme Personality of Godhead could save the poor living entity from such a helpless condition? Pingala stated in a previous verse that even the gods are unable to give actual happiness to a woman. One may question who has authorized this lady to reject even such exalted personalities of Brahma, Shiva, and other gods. The answer given here is that if one actually wants to solve all the problems of life and go back home, back to Godhead, then the only solution is to take shelter of the lotus feet of Lord. It is well known that the gods themselves are subject to birth and death. As stated by the Lord Shiva himself, Mukti Pradata Sarvesham Vishnur Eva Na Samshayaha. There is no doubt that Vishnu is the deliverer of liberation for everyone. Atmaiva Hatmano Gupta Gopta Nirvidyata Nirvidyate Idakilat Aptamattam Idam Prased Grastam Kalayana Jagat. When the living entity sees that the entire universe has been seized by the serpent of time, he becomes sober and sane, and at that time detaches himself from all material sense gratification. In the condition, the living entity is qualified to be his own protector. In this verse, Pingala states that by the Lord's mercy, a self-realized soul can see that the entire universe is existing within the jaws of the great serpent of time. Certainly, this is not a promising situation, and one who sees it loses his desire for sense gratification. Thus, by the Lord's causeless mercy, the spiritually sane living entity can protect himself or herself from the illusion. Since Pingala is now glorifying the personality of Godhead for his mercy in awarding salvation, the following question might arise. Is she worshipping the Lord out of love, or is she merely salvatized, desiring liberation from material existence? In answer, it may be said that in her Krishna conscious situation, she is already liberated. Even though remaining in this world, her program will now be simply to render loving service to the personality of Godhead without any personal desire, including that of salvation. Brahmana uvacha evam vivaditamatirdurasham kantatarshacham chittopashamastaya shayyamupavishasa. The Avadutha Brahmana said, thus her mind completely made up, Pingala cut off all her sinful desires to enjoy sex, pleasure with lovers, and she became situated in a perfect peace. Then she sat down on her bed. Ashahi paramam dukkam nairasham paramam sukam yata samvidya kantatam sukam tushtata Pingala sukam sushpava Pingala. Material desire is undoubtedly the cause of the greatest unhappiness, and freedom from such desire is the cause of the great happiness. Material desire is undoubtedly the cause of the greatest unhappiness, and freedom from such desire is the cause of the greatest happiness. Therefore, completely cutting off her desire to enjoy so-called lovers, Pingala very happily went to sleep. Thus end the purports of the humble servants of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhu, the 8th chapter. The next chapter is the 9th chapter. Avadutha Brahmana Kuru Kuptriinda hididu Brungadavaragiನ 7 ಗುರುಗಳ ಕಥೆ. In the next chapter, Avadutha Brahmana describes 10 remaining gurus, beginning with the Kurur bird. He also described an additional guru, one's own body. The instruction received from the Kurur bird that attachment creates misery, but the person who is unattached and has no material possessions is qualified to achieve unlimited happiness. Instruction received from the Kurur bird is that attachment creates misery, but the person who is unattached and has no material possessions is qualified to achieve unlimited happiness. Avadutha Brahmana learned from the foolish child that by becoming free from anxiety, a person becomes capable of worshipping the Supreme Personality of Godhead and experiencing supreme ecstasy. This is very important. Avadutha Brahmana learned from the foolish, lazy child that by becoming free from anxiety, a person becomes capable of worshipping the Supreme Personality of Godhead and experiencing the supreme ecstasy. The instruction received from the young girl who kept just one conch shell bracelet on each wrist is that one should remain alone and thus steady one's mind. Then only will it be possible for one to fix one's mind completely on the personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. Once several men arrived to ask for the hand of a young girl whose relatives had coincidentally left the house. She went inside and began to prepare food for the unexpected guest by beating the rice. At that time, her conch shell bracelets were making a loud noise, rattling against each other. And in order to stop this sound, she broke off the bracelets one by one, until at last only one remained on each arm. Just as 2 or more bracelets make a noise, if even 2 people reside in the same place, what to speak of many? There is every chance of mutual quarrel and useless gossip. The Avadutha Brahmana also received instruction from the arrow maker, who was so absorbed in constructing an arrow that he did not even notice that the king was passing right by him on the road. In the same way, one must strictly control one's mind, concentrating it on the worship of Lord Sri Hari. The Avadutha Brahmana learned from the serpent that a sage should wander alone, should not live in any prearranged place, should be always careful and grave, should not reveal his movements, should take assistance from no one, and should speak little. The instruction obtained from the spider who spins his web from his mouth and then withdraws it is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead similarly creates from out of himself the whole universe and then winds it up from himself. From the weak, fragile material body is subject to birth and death. One who is sober and should become devoid of material attachment to this body and should properly utilize the rare gift of human life in the pursuit of the knowledge, endeavoring always for the achievement of the highest goal. Although the absolute truth is one without a second, the sages have described him in many different ways. Therefore, one may not be able to acquire very firm and complete knowledge from one spiritual master. Srila Sridhara Swami comments, the statement that one requires many spiritual masters certainly needs explanation, since practically all great saintly persons of the past did not take shelter of many spiritual masters, but rather accepted one. The words Jiyate Bahudarastaha, the absolute truth is glorified in many ways by the sages, indicate the personal and impersonal understanding of the absolute truth. In other words, some sages describe only the Lord's impersonal effulgence, which is without spiritual variety, whereas others describe the Lord's manifest form as the personality of Godhead. Thus, merely by hearing from many different authorities, one cannot actually learn the highest perfection of life. The proliferation of differing spiritual authorities is useful only to counteract the living entity's tendency to be grossly materialistic. Different spiritual philosophers create faith in the existence of the soul and may be accepted at that level. But as will be clarified on later verses, the spiritual master who ultimately gives perfect knowledge one. Srila Jiva Goswami comments as follows on this verse. Since it is commonly understood that one is to accept a single spiritual master, why is it recommended that one learn from many so-called spiritual masters appear in the forms of ordinary material objects? The explanation is that one is worshipable spiritual master will instruct one in many departments of knowledge by giving lessons gleaned from ordinary objects. As recommended by the Brahmana Avadutha, one can strengthen the teachings received from one's acharya and avoid transgressing his orders by observing ordinary things in the nature. One should not mechanically receive the teachings of one's guru. One should not mechanically receive the teachings of one's guru. The disciple should be thoughtful and with his own intelligence realize in practice what he has heard from his spiritual master by observing the world around him. In this sense, one may accept many gurus, though not those who preach against the knowledge received from the bona fide spiritual master. In other words, one should not hear from the persons like the atheist Kapila. In other words, one should not hear from persons like the atheist people. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakura also comments in this verse as follows. It is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam, Tasmad Gurum Prapadyeti Jijnashu Shreya Uttamam. Therefore, one should approach a bona fide spiritual master if one actually desires to achieve the highest perfection in life. Similarly, in chapter 10, verse 5 of this canto, the personality of Godhead himself states that mad abhijnanam gurum santam upastita mad atmakam. One must serve a bona fide spiritual master who is in full knowledge of my personality and who is not different from me. There are many similar verses in Vedic literature indicating that one must take shelter of a single bona fide spiritual master. We also have these examples of innumerable great saintly persons who do not accept more than one spiritual master. Thus, it is in fact that we should accept the bona fide spiritual master and receive from him the particular mantra that one is to chant. I myself certainly follow this principle and worship my bona fide spiritual master. However, in worshipping one's acharya, one may take help from good and bad examples. By observing examples of good behavior, one will be strengthened in devotional service, and in seeing negative examples, one will be forewarned and avoid danger. In this way, one may accept many ordinary material objects as one is spiritual masters, considering them as Shiksha Gurus, or Gurus who give important lessons for spiritual advancement. Thus, in the Lord's own words, one should approach a single bona fide spiritual master who is in full knowledge of the Lord's personality and sincerely worship him, consider him to be the Madatmakam, are non-different from the Lord himself. This statement does not contradict what the Lord has presented in the teachings of the Avadutha Brahmana. If one receives the teachings of one's acharya but keeps them locked up in his brain as his theoretical dogma, one will make little advancement. To develop steady, complete knowledge, one must see the teachings of one's acharyas everywhere. Thus, Vaishnava offers all respect to anyone or anything that gives him further enlightenment in the path of worshipping his bona fide acharya, who is not different from the Lord Krishna. Among the many gurus mentioned by the Brahmana, some gave positive instructions and others gave negative instructions. Pingala, the prostitute, and the young girl who took off her bracelets provide examples of proper conduct, whereas the hapless pigeons and the foolish honeybee provide examples of behavior to be avoided. In both cases, one's spiritual knowledge is enriched. Thus, one should not misunderstand the meaning of this verse in a way contradictory to the Lord's statement, Madapnina Guru Santam Upastitaha Madatmakam. Sri Bhagavanuvacha Ityaktasa idam praprastadamatram gambhiradihi vandito prito rajnayo prito yatagatam. Having thus spoken to King Yadu, the wise Brahmana accepted obeisances and worship from the king and felt pleased with himself. Then, bidding farewell, he left exactly as he had come. Many Yadus, Srila Sridhara Swami gives evidence from Srimad Bhagavatam that the Brahmana Avadutha was actually the incarnation of Godhead Dattathreya. The Bhagavatam states, many Yadus, Hayas, etc. became so purified by the grace of lotus feet of Dattathreya, the Lord, and they obtained both material and spiritual blessings. This verse mentions that Yadu was purified by contact with the lotus feet of Dattathreya, and similarly, the present verse states, Vanditosva Achito Rajna. King Yadu worshipped the lotus feet of the Brahmana. Thus, according to the Srila Sridhara Swami, the Avadutha Brahmana is the personality of Godhead himself, and this is confirmed by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakura. Avadutha vachaha shrutva purvesham na sampurjaha sarvasanga vinurmuktaha samachitto bhavuvaha. O Uddhava, hearing the words of Avadutha, the saintly king of Yadu, who is the forefather of our own ancestors, became free from all material attachment, and thus his mind was eventually evenly fixed on the spiritual platform and praising Lord Krishna. Here the Lord appraises his own dynasty called Yadu Vamsha, because there appeared in that dynasty many great self-realized kings. King Yadu was enlightened by the Dattathreya Swami in the form of an Avadutha Brahmana who taught the king to fix his consciousness on the spiritual platform and detachment by simply observing the creation of the God. Thus end the purports of the humble province of His Divine A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada to the 11th canto, 9th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Detachment from All That is Material. Next chapter is the 10th chapter of the 11th canto. This gives the nature of fruitive activity. In this chapter, Lord Sri Krishna refutes the philosophy of the followers of Jaimini and describes to Uddhava how the spirit soul bound within the material body can develop pure transcendental knowledge. The Vaishnava are one who has taken the shelter of Supreme Personality of Godhead. Vishnu should observe the rules and regulations found in the Pancharatra and other revealed scriptures. According to his own natural qualities of the work, he should follow the code of Varnashrama Dharma in a spirit free from motivation. The so-called knowledge received through one's material senses, mind and intelligence is as useless as the dreams experienced by the sleeping person attached to sense gratification. Therefore, one should give up work performed for sense gratification. According to his own natural qualities of the work, he should follow the code of Varnashrama Dharma in a spirit-free form motivation. The so-called knowledge received through one's material senses, mind, and intelligence is as useless as the dreams experienced by the sleeping person attached to sense gratification. Therefore, one should give up work performed for a sense gratification and accept work as a matter of duty. When one has come to understand something of the truth of the self, he should give up material work performed out of duty and simply engage himself in the service of the bona fide spiritual master, who is the manifest representative of the personality of Godhead. The servant of the spiritual master should have very firm affection for his guru, should be anxious to receive from him knowledge of the absolute truth, and should be devoid of envy and a tendency to talk nonsense. To avoid of the envy and a tendency to talk nonsense, the soul is distinct from the gross and subtle material bodies. The spirit soul who has entered into the material body accepts bodily functions. The spirit soul who has entered into the material body accepts the bodily functions according to the reactions of his own past activities. Therefore, only bona fide transcendental spiritual master is capable of demonstrating pure knowledge of the self. The followers of Gemini and other atheistic philosophers accept regulated material work as the purpose of life. But Krishna refutes this by explaining that the embodied soul who has come into contact with segmented material time takes upon himself a perpetual chain of births and deaths and is therefore forced to suffer the consequent happiness and distress. In this way, there is no possibility that one who has attached to the fruits of his material work can achieve any substantial goal in life. The pleasures of heaven and other destinations which are achieved by sacrificial rituals can be experienced for only a short time. After one's enjoyment is finished, one must return to this mortal sphere to partake of lamentation and suffering. On the path of the materialism, there is certainly no uninterrupted of natural happiness. The Supreme Personality of Godhead says, taking full shelter in me, with the mind carefully fixed in the devotional service of the Lord, as spoken by me, one should live without a personal desire and practice the social and occupational system called Varnashrama. A purified soul should see that because the conditioned souls who are dedicated to sense gratification have falsely accepted the objects of sense pleasure as truth, all of their endeavors are doomed to failure. One who is sleeping may see many objects of sense gratification in a dream, but such pleasurable things are merely a creations of the mind and are thus ultimately useless. Similarly, the living entity who is asleep to his spiritual identity also sees many sense objects, but these innumerable objects of temporary gratification are creations of the Lord's illusory potency and have no permanent existence. One who meditates upon them, impelled by the senses, uselessly engages his intelligence. One who has fixed me within his mind as the goal of life should give up activities based on the sense gratification and should instead execute work governed by the regulative principles of the advancement. When, however, one is fully engaged in searching out the ultimate truth of the soul, one should not accept the scriptural injunctions governing fruitive activities. Srila Vishwanatha Chakravarti Thakur explains that the words Jijnashyam Sampravartam refer to one who is yoga arudha, or advanced in yoga process. One who has accepted me as the supreme goal of life should strictly observe the scriptural injunctions forbidding sinful activities, and as far as possible should execute the injunctions prescribing minor regulative duties such as cleanliness. Ultimately, however, one should approach a bona fide spiritual master who is full in knowledge of me as I am, who is peaceful and who by spiritual elevation is not different from me. Bhagavanuvacha, one who has accepted me as the supreme goal of life should strictly observe the scriptural injunctions forbidding the sinful activities. This is a good warning to all the devotees, because if devotees has a goal, supreme goal to reach Lord Krishna, should strictly observe the scriptural injunctions. Scriptural injunctions means that we have to follow the Shastra, Veda and Shastra, we have to follow. Forbidding sinful activities, that means we should not engage in any sinful activities, and as far as possible should execute the injunctions prescribing minor regulative duties such as cleanliness, Shuchitva. Ultimately, however, one should approach a bona fide spiritual master who is full in knowledge of me as I am, who is peaceful and who my spiritual elevation is not different from me. It's very hard to find a guru like that. The servant or disciple of the spiritual master should be free from false prestige, never considering himself to be the doer. He should be active and never lazy, and should give up all of sense of proprietorship over the objects of the senses, including his wife, children, home, and society. He should be endowed with feelings of loving friendship toward the spiritual master and should never become deviated or bewildered. The servant or disciple should always desire advancement in spiritual knowledge and understanding, should not envy anyone, and should always avoid useless conversation. No one can claim to be the permanent proprietor of the so-called wife, family, home, society, and so on. Such material relationships appear and disappear like bubbles in the surface of the ocean. No one can claim to be the creator of material elements that produced one's home, society, and family. If it were a fact that parents were the ultimate creators of the bodies, if it were a fact that parents were the ultimate creators of the bodies of their children, children would never die before their parents. The parents would simply create a new bodies of the children. Similarly, parents would also not die because they would create a new bodies for themselves to replace the old ones. Actually, the God creates everyone's bodies. Actually, God creates everyone's bodies as well as the material elements with which we build our material societies. Therefore, before death drags these things out of our grasp, we should voluntarily engage them in the loving service of the spiritual master who is the bona fide representative of Lord Krishna. Then such material objects, instead of causing lamentation, will be the cause of happiness. One should see one's real self-interest in life in all circumstances and should therefore remain detached from wife, children, home, land, relatives, friends, wealth, and so on. That's called Vairagya. You need to concentrate on Lord Krishna and forget all the other attachment. Just as fire which burns and illuminates is different from firewood, which is to be burned to give illumination. Similarly, the seer within the body, the self-enlightened spirit soul, is different from material body, which is to be illuminated by consciousness. Thus, the spirit soul and the body possesses different characteristics and are separate entities. Just as fire may appear differently as dormant, manifest, weak, brilliant, and so on, according to the condition of the fuel, similarly the spirit soul enters the material body and accepts particular bodily characteristics. The subtle and the gross material bodies are created by the material modes of nature which expand from the potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Material existence occurs when the living entity falsely accepts the qualities of the gross and subtle bodies as being his own factual nature. The illusory state, however, can be destroyed by real knowledge. Regarding the analogy comparing the fire and its fuel to the soul and the body, one may argue that to some extent fire is dependent upon its fuel. Regarding the analogy comparing the fire and its fuel to the soul and the body, one may argue that to some extent fire is dependent upon its fuel and cannot exist without it. Therefore, by the cultivation of knowledge, one should approach the Supreme Person of Godhead situated within oneself. By understanding the Lord's pure transcendental existence, one should gradually give up the false vision of the material world as independent reality. The spiritual master can be compared to the lower kindling stick, the disciple to the upper kindling stick, and the instruction given by the Guru to the third stick placed in the between. The transcendental knowledge communicated from Guru to disciple is compared to the fire arising from the contact of these, which burns the darkness of ignorance to ashes, bringing great happiness both to Guru and disciple. The spiritual master can be compared to a lower kindling stick, the disciple to the upper kindling stick. Spiritual master can be compared to the lower kindling stick and the disciple to the upper kindling stick, and the instruction given by the Guru to the third stick placed in between. The transcendental knowledge communicated from Guru to disciple is compared to the fire arising from the contact of these, which burns the darkness of ignorance to ashes, bringing great happiness for both Guru and to the disciple. By submissively hearing from an expert spiritual master, the expert disciple develops pure knowledge, which repels the onslaught of material illusion arising from the three modes of material nature. Finally, this pure knowledge itself ceases, just as fire ceases when the stock of fuel has been consumed. Hello? Hello? Sorry, dear. Sorry, we are in the middle of the meeting. Thank you. By submissively hearing from an expert spiritual master, the expert disciple develops pure knowledge. By submissively hearing from an expert spiritual master, the expert disciple develops pure knowledge, which repels the onslaught of material illusion arising from the three modes of material nature. Finally, this pure knowledge itself ceases, just as fire ceases when the stock of fuel has been consumed. My dear Uddhava, I have thus explained to you the perfect knowledge. There are philosophers, however, who challenges my conclusion. They state that the natural position of the living entity is to engage in fruitive activities, and they see him as the enjoyer of the happiness and unhappiness and accrued from his own work. According to this materialistic philosophy, the world, time, the revealed scriptures, and the self are all variegated and eternal, existing as a perpetual flow of transformations. Knowledge, moreover, cannot be one or eternal because it arises from the different and unchanging forms of objects. Thus, knowledge itself is always subject to change. Even if you accept such a philosophy, my dear Uddhava, there will still be perpetual birth, death, and old age and disease, since all living entities must accept a material body subject to the influence of time. In this verse, according to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakura, Lord Krishna speaks the following to Uddhava. My dear Uddhava, I have clearly established the actual goal of life in the instructions I have just imparted to you. There are those, however, who challenge my conclusion, especially the followers of Jaimini Kavi. If you are favorable to their understanding and thus do not accept my instructions, then kindly hear the following explanation. According to the followers of Jaimini, the living entity is originally and naturally a performer of fruitive activities, and his happiness and distress are derived from the fruits of his own work. The world in which the living entities find their enjoyment, the time during which they enjoy, the revealed scriptures that explain the means for achieving enjoyment, and the subtle bodies through which the living entities experience enjoyment all exist not only in manifold variety but also eternally. The living entity need not develop detachment from the material sense gratification, either by seeing the temporariness of individual material objects and situations or by seeing the material world as an illusory creation, Maya. According to such materialistic philosophy, material objects such as garlands, sandalwood, and beautiful women are temporary in specific manifestation but perpetually exist through the natural flow of creation and destruction. In other words, although a particular woman's form is temporary, there will eternally be beautiful women within the material world. Thus, by carefully executing fruitive rituals according to religious scriptures, one can maintain enjoyable contact with woman and wealth life after life. In this way, one's sense gratification will be eternal. Jaimini philosophers further say that there never was a time when the world did not exist. The Jaimini philosophers further say that there never was a time when the world did not exist as it does today, which implies that there is no supreme controller who has created it. They claim that the arrangement of this world is real and appropriate and thus is not illusory. Moreover, they say that there is no eternal knowledge of an original perpetual form of the soul. In fact, they say knowledge arises not from some absolute truth, but from the differences among the material objects. Knowledge, therefore, is not eternal and is subject to change. The assumption hidden in this statement is that there is no spirit soul who possesses eternal constant knowledge of a single unchanging reality. Rather, the nature of consciousness or knowledge is that it undergoes constant transformation. They state, however, that eternity is not refuted by the perpetually transforming nature of consciousness. Consciousness perpetually exists, they say, but not in the same form. Thus, the followers of Jaimini conclude that the transformation of knowledge does not negate its eternality. Rather, they state that the knowledge eternally exists within the perpetual nature of its transformation. They therefore naturally come to the path of regulated sense gratification rather than the path of renunciation. For in the state of mukti or liberation, the living entity would not have any material senses, and thus the transformation of material understanding would not be possible. Such philosophers consider that the achievement of an unchanging state of mukti would stunt or paralyze the natural activity of the living entity, and thus would not be in his self-interest. The path of nivritti, aiming toward renunciation and transcendence of the material world, is naturally not interesting to such materialist philosophers. Accepting, for argument's sake, the validity of such materialistic philosophy, one can easily demonstrate that path of regulated sense gratification brings many unwanted and miserable results to the living entity. Therefore, even from a materialistic viewpoint, detachment is desirable. Material time is divided into different sections such as days, weeks, months, and years. And by material time, the living entity is forced to undergo the miseries of birth, death, and old age and disease. That such real miseries occur everywhere throughout the universe is well known. In this way, Says Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakura, Lord Krishna has pointed out that the defect of materialistic philosophy of Uddhava. We may further elaborate that if one falsely accepts the atheistic philosophy of Gemini and his innumerable modern followers, then the living entity perpetually remains entangled in the anguish of birth, death, old age, and disease. This bogus atheistic philosophy encourages material gratification as the only logical goal of life, but the living entity will inevitably commit mistakes in the execution of regulated sense gratification and eventually go to hell. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna, personally tells Uddhava that this materialistic philosophy is false and irrelevant to the actual self-interest of the living entity. Although the performer of fruitive activities desires perpetual happiness, it is clearly observed that materialistic workers are often unhappy and only occasionally satisfied, thus proving that they are not independent or in control of their destiny. When a person is always under the superior control of another, how can he expect any valuable results from his own fruitive action? It is observed within the material world that sometimes even an intelligent person is not happy. Similarly, sometimes even a great fool is happy. The concept of becoming happy through expertly performing material activities is simply a useless exhibition of false egotism. It may be argued that an intelligent person can expertly perform pious activities within the material world and thus never experiences suffering, since unhappiness is caused by sinful or impious activities. However, we often observe great suffering even among pious, intelligent persons because they sometimes fail in the execution of their duty and sometimes consciously or unconsciously perform forbidden activity. With this argument, the Lord refutes the theory that simply on the strength of material piety, one may remain perpetually happy without Krishna consciousness. On the other hand, we observe that even the most foolish or sinful persons sometimes experience happiness because even those completely dedicated to sin sometimes accidentally perform pious activities by inadvertently traveling through a holy place or helping a saintly person. The material creation of God is so complex and bewildering that even those dedicated to piety sometimes commit sins, and even those dedicated to sinful life sometimes perform pious actions. Therefore, within the material world, we do not find absolute happiness or unhappiness. Rather, very conditioned soul is hovering in confusion. Without perfect knowledge, piety and sin are relatively material ideas that bestow relative happiness and unhappiness. Absolute happiness is experienced on the spiritual platform in full Krishna consciousness or love of God. Thus, material life is always ambiguous and relative, whereas Krishna consciousness is the actual platform of perfect happiness. Even if people know how to achieve happiness and avoid unhappiness, they still do not know the process by which death will not be able to exert its power over them. Death is not at all pleasing, and since everyone is exactly like a condemned man being led to the place of execution, what possible happiness can people derive from material objects or the gratification they provide? The material happiness of which we hear, such a promotion to heavenly planets for celestial enjoyment, is just like that material happiness we have already experienced. Both are polluted by jealousy, envy, decay, and death. Therefore, just as an attempt to raise crops become fruitless if there are many problems like crop disease, insect plague, or drought. Similarly, the attempt to attain material happiness either on earth or on the heavenly planets is always fruitless because of innumerable obstacles. If one performs Vedic sacrifices and fruitive rituals without any mistake or contamination, one will achieve a heavenly situation in the next life. But even this result, which is only achieved by perfect performance of fruitive rituals, will be vanquished by time. Now hear of this. The word gachati means going. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna states, Agamapayino nityaha, all material experiences, good or bad, come and go. Therefore, the word gachati refers to the disappearance of the results of even the most meticulously performed fruitive sacrifices. Any material situation, from worst to the best, is impediment. If on the earth one performs sacrifices for the satisfaction of the gods, he goes to the heavenly planets, where just like a god, he enjoys all of the heavenly pleasures he has earned by his performances. Having achieved the heavenly planets, the performer of ritualistic sacrifices travels in a glowing airplane, which obtains as a result of his piety on earth. Being glorified by songs sung by Gandharvas and dressed in wonderfully charming clothes, he enjoys life surrounded by heavenly goddesses. Accompanied by heavenly women, the enjoyer of the fruits of sacrifice goes on pleasure rides in a wonderful airplane, which is decorated with circles of tinkling bells, and which flies wherever he desires. Being relaxed comfortably and happy in the heavenly pleasure gardens, he does not have considered that he is exhausting the fruits of his piety and will soon fall down to the material world. Until the pious results are used up, the performer of sacrifice enjoys life in the heavenly planets. When the pious results are exhausted, however, he falls down from the pleasure gardens of heaven, being moved against his desire by the force of external time. If a human being is engaged in a sinful, irreligious activities, either because of bad association or because of his failure to control his senses, then such a person will certainly develop a personality full of material desires. He thus becomes miserly toward others, greedy and always anxious to exploit the bodies of women. When the mind is so polluted, one becomes violent and aggressive, and without the authority of Vedic injunction, slaughters innocent animals for sense gratification. Worshipping ghosts and spirits, the bewildered persons falls fully into the grip of unauthorized activities, and thus going to hell, where he receives a material body infected by darkest mode of nature. In such a degraded body, he unfortunately continues to perform inauspicious activities that greatly increases future unhappiness, and therefore he again accepts a similar material body. What possibly happiness can there be for one who engages in activities inevitably terminating in death? In the Vedic analysis of civilized life, there are two paths. One who takes to the path of Nivritti Marga immediately renounces material sense gratification and purifies his existence by performing austerity and devotional activities. On the path of Pravritti Marga, one who furnishes a steady supply of sense objects to the senses, but one consumes such sense objects under the strict regulations and through ritualistic ceremonies, thus gradually purifying the heart and satiating the material senses. Unfortunately, as explained in this and the previous verse, the path of Pravritti Marga is extremely available, because rather than Unfortunately, as explained in this and the previous verse, the path of Pravritti Marga is extremely volatile, because rather than becoming detached, the living entity often becomes uncontrolled and fully addicted to further sense of gratification. In the previous verse, the path of regulated authorized sense gratification was described, and in this verse, the path of unauthorized demonic sense gratification is described. In this verse, the words Sangada Astam Vachetendriya are very significant. One may fall down into sinful life by bad association or even in good association, or may fail to control his senses. Ultimately, each living entity is responsible for his existential situation. The word adharma rataha in this verse indicates those engaged in excessive sex life, meat eating, drinking, and other inauspicious activities that transgress the course of civilized human life. Being in the mode of ignorance, these persons develop such a cruel mentality that they do not consider any festive occasion complete without the consumption of a large quantities of meat obtained by slaughtering helpless animals. Eventually, such persons become influenced by ghosts and spirits who deprive them of all ability to discriminate between right and wrong. Losing all sense of decency, they become fit candidates for entrance into the darkest modes of material existence. Sometimes these lusty, intoxicated carnivores, considering themselves pious, pray to God in useless way, by afflicted losing all sense of decency, they become fit candidates for entrance into the darkest modes of material existence. Sometimes these lusty, intoxicated carnivores, considering themselves pious, pray to God in a useless way, afflicted by innumerable material desire. They rotate from one material body to another material body without experiencing the true happiness. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur has noted that material life is so disturbing that even if one is allowed to live for an entire day of Brahma, approximately 8.64 million years, one will eventually be afflicted by the fear of the death. In fact, Brahma himself is disturbed by fear of death. What to speak of tiny human beings who live a paltry 70 or 80 years at most? Thus, as stated here, Kim Sukham Martya Dharminaha. What possible happiness can be obtained in all the planetary systems, from the heavenly to the hellish, and for all the great gods who live for 1,000 yuga cycles, there is a fear of me in my form of time. Even Brahma, who possesses the supreme lifespan of 311,040 million years, is also afraid of me. There are many statements throughout Vedic literature proving that even the great gods fear the time potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Even in heavenly planets, there is no relief from the miseries of the material life. No conditioned soul can live eternally, as clearly demonstrated by the deaths of Hiranyakashipu and other demons. Since even the demigods, for the fear of time, potency, and personality of Godhead, one may easily conclude that Krishna is the absolute truth and that he is eternally the supreme controller of everything and everyone. Lord Krishna is the only real shelter. Gunasrujanti karmani gunonusrujate gunan jivastu guna samyukto bhukte karma palan nasau. The material senses create material activities, either pious or sinful, and the modes of nature set the material senses into the motion. The living entity, being fully engaged by the material senses and modes of nature, experiences the various results of the fruitive work. It has been explained in the previous verses that the serving entity under the control of fruitive activities is pushed down into a hellish condition of life sometimes. As long as the living entity thinks that the modes of material nature have separate existence, he will be obliged to take birth in many different forms and will experience varieties of material existence. Therefore, the living entity remains completely dependent on the fruitive activities under the modes of nature. As long as the living entity thinks that the modes of material nature have separate existence, he will be obliged to take birth in many different forms and will experience varieties of material existence. Therefore, the living entity remains completely dependent on the fruitive activities under the mode of nature. The conditioned soul who remains dependent on fruitive activities under the material modes of nature will continue to fear me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since I impose the results of one's fruitive activities. Those who accept the material concept of life, taking the variegatedness of the modes of nature, to be factual, devote themselves to material enjoyment, and are therefore always absorbed in lamentation and grief. The living entity is bound in the network of illusion, but although he can understand that he is dependent upon the superior powers, he does not want to serve the Supreme Lord. When there is agitation and interaction of the material modes of nature, the living entities then describe me in various ways, such as all powerful time, the self, Vedic knowledge, the universe, one's own nature, and religious surveys, and so on. Sri Uddhava says, O my Lord, a living entity situated within the material body is surrounded by the modes of nature, and the happiness and distress that are born of activities caused by these modes. How is it possible that he is not bound by the material encirclement? Uddhava is asking the question. It may also be said that the living entity is ultimately transcendental and has nothing to do with the material world. Then how is he ever bound by material nature? Uddhava's question is this: O my Lord, a living entity situated within the material body is surrounded by the modes of nature and the happiness and distress that are born of activities caused by these modes. These modes are three modes: Sattvika Guna, Rajasika Guna, and Tamasika Guna. How is it possible that he is not bound by this material encirclement? It may also be said that the living entity is ultimately the transcendental and has nothing to do with the material world. Then he is ever bounding O my Lord, Achyuta, the same living entity is sometimes described as eternally conditioned and at the other times as eternally liberated. I am not able to understand, therefore, the actual situation of living entity. You, my Lord, are the best of those who are expert in answering philosophical questions. Please explain to me the symptoms by which one can tell the difference between a living entity who is eternally liberated and one who is eternally conditioned. In what various ways would then remain situated, enjoy life, eat, evacuate, lie down, sit, or move about? In the previous verse, Lord Krishna has explained to Uddhava that an eternally liberated soul is beyond the three modes of material nature. Since a liberated soul is considered to be beyond even the superior mode of goodness, how can he be recognized? By false identification with modes of nature which produce one's own material body, one is bound by illusion. On the other hand, by transcending the modes of nature, one is liberated. However, in ordinary activities such as eating, evacuating, relaxing, sitting, and sleeping, a liberated soul and a conditioned soul appear to be the same. Therefore, Uddhava is inquiring, by what symptoms can I recognize that one living entity is performing such external activities without a false ego? And by what symptoms can I recognize one who is working under the illusory bondage of material identification? This is difficult because the ordinary bodily functions of liberated and conditioned personalities appear similar. Uddhava has approached the Supreme Personality of Godhead, taking him as his personal spiritual master. and wants to be enlightened about how to understand the difference between the material and spiritual life. Since the living entity is sometimes called eternally conditioned, how could he ever be considered eternally liberated, or vice versa? This is an apparent contradiction which will be created by the Supreme Person of Godhead. Thus, and the purports of humble servants of His divine grace, H.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Thus end the purports of the humble servants of His divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, to the 11th canto, 10th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled The Nature of Fruitive Activity. So, Uddhava questioned, what are the symptoms, conditioned and liberated living entities? We need to identify the difference between the conditioned soul and liberated soul in the society. That is Uddhava's question. And we are going to read that in tomorrow's discussion, 11th chapter of the 11th canto, that is tomorrow. That's called Buddha Mukta Mukta Bhakta Janara Lakshana Gano. The liberated souls are the devotees who are having characters. Conditioned souls are souls who are in the process of devotion. So we will analyze tomorrow these things. Namostu Anantaya Sahasramurtaye Sahasrapadaksharbha Sasanamne Purushaste Sahasrakoti Yugadarane Namaha Sahasrakoti Yugadarane Namaha Akashat Patitam Medagit Sagaram Sarvade Namaskara Sri Kesham Pariyatyo Namaha Sarva Vedeshat Punyam Sarva Tirtesh Vatpalam Tatpalam Purnaptu Vasanad Vasdevasya Vashtante Jagatrem Sarva Bhuta Nivasosi Vasdevamustevam Kayena Vacha Manasendreva Buddhatmanama Pakute Sabhava Karomi Adyat Sagalam Parasmai Narayanaye Samarpayami Narayanaye Samarpayami. Tomorrow we are going to start the 11th chapter. It is extremely difficult to understand this part of Bhagavata because the concentration and repeated reading are essential to understand the entire Bhagavata properly. So it is not easy. Thank you very much.